that we have the ability to delete our tasks, it's a bit easier while we develop to clear off some of the junk in our list. And speaking of junk tasks, check something out. If I do add in the app for a new task and just immediately hit save, look at that, a blank task. I do that again, and another one, and another one. Okay, looks a bit silly. I'll just go ahead and delete a couple of those with my long click. So now we're on part 2 of our Tasks app project. We want to start thinking about getting it to a point where it is professional, finished, the complete product. And let's ask ourselves, do we want our users to be able to add blank tasks? Is that a good user experience? If they open the task dialog but accidentally maybe tap twice, you see how close to the plus button that save button is, it could easily happen. It just looks a bit amateur, if you ask me. So we should go ahead now and do something to improve this user experience. So what could we do? I'll open the dialog. Well, we could, when they hit save, show a toast. So at the point they press the button, check the task title, and if it's empty, have a little pop-up or toast saying you can't add a blank task. That could be okay. But do you know what I think would be better? They can't even press the save button initially, and then as they start to type, then the button becomes enabled. So rather than giving them the ability to add a blank task, remove it as a possibility altogether. So I'm over in main activity, which has our show add task dialog. It's in this code here, line 41 for me, where we're going to be doing the work. Let's first of all introduce a couple of new concepts, one of which is the ability to have a view be disabled. So we have our save button. I'm inside my scope function, my apply scope function, so I have access to my dialog add task binding. That's the layout for this dialog. If I just make some line breaks after where we set the content view, we can go ahead and do the button save, so our save button, and just like there's a property for visibility, to make it visible or not, or gone, well, there's a property for is enabled. Now we're using the material library with a material theme. These buttons are already nicely styled. We have a text button, but watch what happens when I do is enabled equals false. I'll just go ahead and run this. Okay, and when I open the dialog now, well, our formerly purple button is now grey. So it actually looks a little bit more disabled. It doesn't look as immediately appealing. And if I try and click save now, and we do have an on-click listener set, you can see it there on line 53, but if I click save, nothing happens. The on-click listener that we have set doesn't fire. The button doesn't even register the click event, and that is good. And just note that you can set any view to be disabled. We could go ahead and make our star task button is enabled equals false. We could even make the edit text title is enabled false. Okay, it's quite a useful thing to be able to do, because when I run the app now and press the add dialog button, the button is disabled. Clicking the star checkbox does nothing. Clicking in the text field does nothing. So in our Android views, we have lots of things we have control over programmatically, actually in the Kotlin code. Visibility, adding click listeners, and the ability to set a view as enabled or not. And when using the material theme, the material design library, not only does it prevent the user from interacting with the view, but often it will give it a disabled looking state. The thing will look a little bit more grey, it will hide some of the colour to make it look less clickable. With the exception of our star, of course, where we're setting custom icons for that. Okay? I'll go ahead and remove the star task is enabled and the edit task is enabled being false because we do want to be able to click them. But for now, we will leave the is enabled false. Running that again. And when I open the dialog, it's disabled. So that's fantastic. They can't add junk empty tasks. However, there's one small problem. When they start to type my task title, well, the button remains disabled. So we need some mechanism of responding to when the user does start to add some text in the text field. And we'll learn about that in the next tutorial. So we have our button in a disabled state, so that if I have an empty task title, it's not possible to add these silly blank tasks like we had before. However, when the user starts to type, I think the user experience that we want is that the save button automatically becomes enabled. And likewise, if they then delete what they put in and go back to this with nothing in the field, it goes disabled again. And fortunately for us in Android, there is the concept of a text watcher on our edit texts and our text inputs. So underneath where we set the button to be disabled with is enabled equals false, we'll make some line breaks. So this is a thing, like a click listener, that we can add to our edit text. A click listener being some callback code that runs when the button is clicked. There's a similar thing, a text watcher. We can give it a text watcher some blocks of code, and those blocks of code will run whenever the text in an edit text changes. A text watcher, fantastic. So we will do edit text, and we'll do it for the task title. We'll say they must have a task title, and we do add text change listener, capital T, capital C. So add text change listener. Now you can see there's a few versions of this. I would like you to do the one which says watcher of type text watcher. So please select that one. Okay. Now we have an error because this is expecting, like our click listener, an interface, or rather an object that conforms to the text watcher interface, the text watcher contract. So we'll do it as an anonymous class like we've done before moving to the slightly nicer syntax. So we'll do object and then colon, and then we'll start typing text watcher like that. No normal brackets. We'll do a space and the curly brackets and autocomplete. So there's our anonymous text watcher class. We've done this sort of thing before with click listeners before moving to the slightly nicer lambda, and we will move to a lambda in a moment. But I want to show you how this text watcher works before we move to the nice thing. Okay. So we've got an error, and that error is because we're not implementing the members, and there's actually 3 members in a text watcher, and you've got to implement all of them. So I will do Control I, Option I, to show me the things that I need to implement, and it is the before text changed, on text changed, and after text changed. So we'll do OK. I will remove the to-dos so we don't get a crash when we try and run this. If you have that code and it ever fires, it will crash the app. So we'll get rid of that. And we've got these 3 functions: before text changed, with s start count after, on text changed with s start before and count, and then we have after text change. Now these functions are a little bit similar, but they all do slightly different things. The two that would be most useful for us would be on text changed and after text changed. On text changed gives us some more information, like how many new characters we have and the positions of the new characters, but in a way it's almost too much information. So the most useful one for us to do what we need to do is this after text change one, and all you get is an S for an editable, which we can convert to a string, and then we can just check if that string or editable is empty. So let's go ahead and use this one. So we'll leave these two blank, and we can simply do if S for the editable, so that will be the text that we have in our text field, and there's a useful function called is null or empty. So if there's nothing at all, if it's null or empty, we can do one thing, else we can do another. So let's say it's not empty, so we'll do this one, the bottom one first, the else first. So if it's not null or empty, that means they've typed something, so we'll simply do button save dot is enabled equals true. And let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. We'll open the dialog. The button's disabled, it's very light grey. I'll click in here, but then when I start typing, it turns to purple, the button is enabled, and I can add this task. Fantastic. I'll just quickly delete that. However, if I open the dialog, add some text, my new task, the button's available, fantastic, but then I change my mind and delete it all, well, the button stays enabled. I can add my silly blank task. That's no good. So you could probably go ahead and complete this code yourself if you'd like to. I shall just quickly do the obvious thing, which is to make the button save dot is enabled equals false. Now, when we do this, we get a little suggestion on the if statement, and when we hover over it, it says it's redundant. And if you then click on that and do Alt Enter, Option Enter, it says we can remove this redundant if statement. And you might be a little bit confused by what it does if we autocomplete this. But let's go with that suggestion. Press Enter. Button.save.is enabled equals exclamation mark that. Let's just break this down 1 second. I'll delete this for now, or rather I'll cut it so I can keep it in memory. So Control X, Command X. So we can set true or false here. We can do true, we can do false. We know that. Well, if I just press undo a few times to go back to our if statement, well, this thing inside here is true or false. If something which is true or false. If our text is null or empty. If it's true, make that false. If it's false, make it true. So if I press Control Shift Z to redo that, to put it all back in, and then I paste that thing that I cut, well, this is the same thing. I'll remove the exclamation mark for now. S dot is null or empty. If it's empty, it will be true. If it's not empty, it will be false. But we want the opposite. So if it's null or empty, if this is true, well, then we want is enabled to be false. But if it's not empty, if it's false, we want is enabled to be true. And that's what the exclamation mark does. It reverses it. Okay? The exclamation mark basically reverses the true or false. So that is the same thing, believe it or not, as, if I just undo everything, that. So you can skip the whole if statement and the braces and the else and simply have is enabled equals the inverse of whether it's empty or not. Okay? And so now when we run this and open the dialog, button is disabled, I start typing, it's enabled, but I delete it all again, and it goes back to disabled. And that is quite a nice user experience, and it completely prevents the user from a totally empty task, which is what we want. Just quickly back at the code to round off this tutorial, I am not a fan of having to implement an interface with 3 functions and having 2 that are completely empty. It just looks a bit messy. We're having however many lines of code that is, 10, 11 lines that we don't really need. And so, fortunately for us, with Kotlin, they have given us some shortcuts. If I just cut this line, so Control X, Command X, keep it in memory, and delete all of that, and even delete the text change listener, there's a shortcut to this. And so if you remember when we did add text change listener, add text change, there's a few versions, and fortunately for us, there is the add text changed one with a lambda. If I go ahead and do that one and enter, you can see it editable. Think like our scope function, so let scope cool. So this it equals our text after the text has changed. I can paste what I had before. Now before it was called S, not a particularly good name S. We could do it. I don't even like the word it here. I would rather name this. Anything that is an it in a lambda can be named. So let's instead call this simply the input with an arrow. And then we can have some lovely reading code that says if, well rather, the reverse of input being null or empty. So is enabled is the opposite of if the input is null or empty. And I can run this now, open the dialog, disable button, and start typing, and it becomes enabled. I can delete it, disabled, and then finally I can add my real task, and then save. So that is text watchers in Android, something very useful you can add to a text field. We've seen the full interface with all 3 functions, all similar but slightly different. And you've seen by far the most useful one, the add text change listener, lambda. Really easy. This will cover 95% of your use cases. Add text change listener, and you get an update every time the user input changes there. And then you can run some code. Great stuff. Okay, let's move on.